Hello everyone, we are back on the public space right after our discussion with No White Guilt, which was amazing. We are taking over the continuation of our Frame Games report on the question of the real estate crisis and its relation to the diversity industry. It's a pleasure to have him again. Frame Games, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, JF. Excited to pick the conversation back up.
All right, so last week you wowed us. Just to summarize for people joining us, you showed us that there is heavy laws that are essentially enforcing diversity, and that these heavy laws that are enforcing that lead banks to do decisions that they wouldn't do rationally without the legal context that we've created. It pushed them to land in a irresponsible fashion, in a fashion that they wouldn't have converged toward in pure capitalism and in pursuing their self-interest, but in a context where they were forced by law to do so, they were led to do very bad decisions. Is that a good summary of what we learned last week?
That is a pretty good summary. There's some other dynamics to include in it, which include the fact that not just making bad decisions, but really changing the entire incentive structure of finance, of real estate, and of the government regulators themselves because of explicitly racial or ethnic considerations. And that, the sort of subtitle of it was, diversity industries, exploitation of the big banks and how the big banks learned to love them, because of how it actually became profitable to sort of plunge the incentives created by these explicitly racial laws. And the other part I wanted to put around this was that this is something that centrists and classical liberals should be concerned about and interested in as well, because it really violates the Martin Luther King principle of judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of your skin when you have explicitly racialized laws that are distorting the profit motive.
Absolutely. I tend to look at it from a libertarian perspective, and I know that unnatural interactions into the free market always brings trouble, but there is also, as you mentioned, a good, simply humanitarian argument to be made where we are essentially discriminating against people. We are not judging on content or on merit. We are imposing skin color quotas. So last time we left at this page here, and I believe we watched a lot of that video, right? Did we want to look at it in full, or?
I think so. We only watched about the first minute of it. And what this video does a good job of setting up is what you might call affirmative action in the mortgage lending industry and admissions during the Clinton administration in the 1990s, before George W. Bush really lit the match on this, showing the explicitly racial aspects of the Community Reinvestment Act, which, just to recap for folks, was a law passed in 1977 to get rid of the practice of redlining, in which banks would deliberately not make loans to certain neighborhoods because of perceived bad credit risks there, or low growth opportunities for homes. And so in 1977, in order to encourage equal credit for all, a law was passed that scorecarded big banks for how well they reached out to lower income and minority neighborhoods. And in 1995, Bill Clinton poured gas all over that law by forcing banks to actually lend to these majority-minority tracts, and this set the stage for the housing crisis that would first look extremely lucrative from 2002 to 2007, and then ultimately caused the biggest financial crash in human history, other than the 1929 Great Depression, stock market crash then. And we are living in the shadows of it. And just before we jump into the presentation, I want to set the stage a little bit further by reminding folks that this is not just the story of the 2008 financial crisis, but it's also the story of the rise of Donald Trump, because this was the last gasp of neocon total power over the conservative party in America. And the George Bush style, the neocon style of conservative governance, was really for the first time defeated by Donald Trump, who has a very different view towards the scams we're about to see today. So, I hope this is also a history lesson in how far we've come, not just for how corrupt things used to be.
Very interesting.
So, yeah.
So let's have a look at the video. Maybe play it in full.
I think that's good.
But discrimination isn't always that obvious. It's sometimes more subtle, but in many ways more insidious. And institutionalized discrimination that's hidden behind a smiling face. Housing agents who say, well, there are no vacancies right now. That you just didn't qualify for the mortgage because your financial credit history wasn't good enough. Last year, the Federal Reserve Board found African Americans are denied credit for homes at twice the rate white Americans are. And it is pervasive. It's what we found in the banking case in Texas, SacuBank in Texas. Discrimination in lending, discrimination in rendering mortgages. The bank has agreed to change its practices, as you heard from the Assistant Secretary. The bank has also agreed to a $2.1 billion agreement where they'll make $2.1 billion available to families who are low and moderate income across the country for mortgages. About 15,000 low and moderate income people will now be able to buy their own home because of the settlement we announced today. $2.1 billion is by far the largest settlement ever rendered to the federal government to settle a fair housing case. And in closing, the message of today is clear. You've heard it from a number of us now. This is a nation of laws, and this administration will enforce the laws. We'll take questions at this time. Yes, sir. Well, $2.1 billion that would not have been available to families of low and moderate income, low and moderate income families across the country. About 15,000 families we estimate will get mortgages who would not have gotten mortgages otherwise.
So that was in 1998.
1998, correct.
But aggressively to take a greater risk on these mortgages, yes. To give families mortgages who they would not have given otherwise, yes.
Get the loans at all. They wouldn't have.
They would not have qualified but for this affirmative action on the part of the bank, yes.
Minorities are represented in that low and moderate income group?
It is by income, and is it also by minorities? Yes. With the $2.1 billion lending that amount in mortgages, which will be a higher risk, and I'm sure there'll be a higher default rate on those mortgages than on the rest of the portfolio. That is the remedy that we sought, and the remedy that I would prefer. 15,000 families.
He just said, I'm sure people won't be able to pay.
Right?
It's stunning.
This is of a scope so beyond anything that we've really done in the past. We had one settlement just a couple of weeks ago, which was part and parcel of this, which is in the range of about $1 billion. But after that, the closest settlement was $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. So this is of a scope that much surpasses anything we've done in the past.
There was the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, passed in 1977 during Jimmy Carter's first year in office. The law increased oversight of financial institutions to ensure that they were giving credit to low-income families.
We're going to make sure those banks do it and they don't discriminate. But the law went overboard. Institutions made loans they probably didn't want to make because they couldn't seem racist. It empowered these community groups who would then bully the banks. Acorn bullied the banks.
Indeed, ACORN, the Associations of Community Organizers for Reform Now, would before long come up with a new tactic, challenging a thrift merger in Illinois, claiming they didn't make the kind of loans that ACORN felt were required under the CRA. A young community organizer named Barack Obama worked closely with the ACORN.
Oh my God, I didn't know that. I thought that when they were saying he was a community organizer, that he was some sort of sociologist or social worker. But this guy was involved in all this?
Well, remember, this was, we've talked about community organizers and what they actually do. Community organizers are the church groups, they're the activist groups, they're the advocate groups that sue these companies to block regulatory approvals, to influence legislators, and get money for shaking down either banks or large corporations in connection with diversity lawsuits, diversity regulations, and diversity voting considerations. So that is what they do. In fact, there's an amazing backstory to Obama turning down the more lucrative law firm opportunities he had coming out of Harvard Law School to join these tiny little, community organization groups. I mean, the thing is, when you peel behind the curtain, these are multi-billion-dollar enterprises, right? I mean, these are, as we've covered in the Starbucks series, these are hugely connected and influential organizations, which have not only do they have their fingers in private foundation money and huge plaintiffs bar lawsuit revenue streams, but they are part owners of the regulatory bodies that big corporations need approvals from to do business. So the whole thing is extremely dirty from that perspective. And it's one of the reasons it's essential that we cover the industry and how it works. But yes, Barack Obama was an integral part of this, including shakedowns of the Illinois pension system that we covered during the Starbucks series, and many other organizations diverting, billions of dollars to these organizations in the name of racial politics.
Absolutely scandalous.
Activists behind the new strategy.
I've been a community organizer and helped design programs at the ground level.
And that strategy worked. ACORN prevailed in court, and soon credit standards were being lowered across the country. While at first Fannie actually resisted buying up some of those shaky mortgages, at the tail end of the Clinton administration, Fannie Mae was told to substantially increase the percentage of those mortgages in its portfolio.
ACORN's attorney was, well, you guessed it, Barack Obama.
I have a background as an attorney. I've represented affordable housing organizations that build affordable housing, something that's a major issue in the district.
Back in the 1990s, they used strong-arm tactics to force banks to give high-risk loans to low-income borrowers with bad credit.
ACORN uses militant tactics. They call it direct action. Sometimes ACORN will actually send people to a bank official's home. They'll scare him, they'll scare his kids. Again, all in an effort to get the banks to make these bad loans.
You've gone back to Chicago and civic rights, civil rights.
Right. I'm currently a practicing civil rights lawyer, which means that I get involved in a whole range of different issues that touch on issues of race.
We look at the subprime mortgage fiasco that's taking place today. Subprime lending started off as a good idea, helping Americans buy homes who previously couldn't afford to. Financial institutions created new financial instruments that could securitize these loans, slice them into finer and finer risk categories, and spread them out among investors and around the country as well as around the world. In theory, this should have allowed mortgage lending to be less risky and more diversified.
Who do you think is to blame for this current mortgage and credit crisis? Who do we see about that?
Uh-oh. I can't wait to see what he has to say.
Well, I think there are a lot of folks who have to take some responsibility. The original idea was a good one, which was let's
oh my God.
see if we can distribute risk more broadly and make it easier to provide loans to people who otherwise might not be able to get them.
Now, up until then, Acorn has managed to fly below the radar, but their dangerous practices are coming back to haunt them and the rest of the country. The economic crisis facing the nation is due in large part to this disastrous decision by financial institutions Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy up risky loans from small banks. But it's groups like Acorn that force those banks to give out those loans in the first place.
What do you think of the Acorn scandal, and how do you think it will affect the election?
The Acorn scandal is a big one. Acorn has received over $760 million in fees alone. This is what we know about. And there's a lot of stuff that's still kind of bubbling up to the surface. But here's an organization that essentially helped strong-arm a lot of banks into making loans to people who couldn't pay them off, so the so-called ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets. At the heart of what has kind of brought about the financial collapse is this rather unconventional idea that we would just loan money out if a person had a pulse.
I can't believe that all of this has happened in front of my eyes and that I've never been taught anything about it.
You can't believe that, right? It's well, you know, this is the power of words like racism and anti-Semitism and these one-word, thought-stopping kill words. That I mean, what it does is it prevents, more than affecting any individual's reputation, it creates entire swaths of information that are barred from being reported on in the mainstream.
Obvious.
Absolutely. So are we moving on to the continuation of Cuomo, or do we skip the videos?
Sure. Did we get to the end of that video?
Yeah, we were at the end of the video.
Okay.
And now I'm on the next.
So where that got us to, and by the way, there was some incidental coverage of this. If you actually rewind to the slide behind this one, you'll see that there was about 3 weeks of coverage of this issue before it was buried. And if you play the first minute and a half of the Kudlow clip from CNBC, it's on the slide called 1992, Our First Black President. And so Larry Kudlow, who's now part of the Trump administration, was wise to this.
I'm for cowboy capitalism. I mean, I want free markets to solve the housing price problem. I really do. Jerry Borer, you're smiling. I'm for cowboy capitalism. But I want to say this. The subprime mortgage was essentially invented after the 1995 amendments to the Community Reinvestment Act, which put a gun to the head of all lenders, banks and non-banks. It said, you must make subprime loans, below prime loans at favorable interest terms to low-income people, to downright poor people, to immigrants, to Latinos, etc. No, I want to finish this point. I want to get this out on the table. It's been bugging me for a long time. Jerry Borer is the only one that got this story right. This meant that, in fact, if these lenders did not make these subprime loans, their business plans would be disrupted. They couldn't acquire. They couldn't merge. They couldn't go into new markets. And it gave inordinate power to local community groups like the Acorn Group to essentially rat out the lender and tell the Fed and the controller of the currency that you guys, they're not doing what you want them to do. So guess what? With the era of easy money...
This guy laid out your entire theory right there in a minute.
Yeah, he does a good job of it. In fact, we can, they get a little sidetracked there, so we can move on, because I want to get on to what happened when this thing ignited and why, right? Because in part one, we covered what was in it for the big banks. They needed regulatory approval to do business. You're in the era of private equity, of mega mergers, of expansion and growth. And you need 4 commissioners with different approvals in order to go through with your mergers and acquisition activity. And you've got a whole new market that pops up beginning in 1992 with Acorn, with the National Action Group, with groups like Power that we saw from the Starbucks series, the Pico Network, hundreds of others. When we talked in part one about the NCRC, an organization that has the head of the comptroller in its pocket that has 600 local major metropolitan left-wing racial advocate groups that lobby on Congress and that file these lawsuits. We saw all that in part one. And the question was, well, okay, I get that those groups want the money, and I get that the big banks want to be able to just do business, but what's in it for the regulators? Why would they set up this system to begin with? And that's kind of where we left off. So just before moving on to the section entitled The Match, the last thing we covered was what was happening in the world right before George Bush took office. And that's I guess actually if we'll go to the slide called the CRA with Teeth and the Death of Data. This was right before the Clinton era ended, and what banks were starting to have to do to comply with this newly weaponized Community Reinvestment Act that required them to lower their credit standards to make sufficient numbers of minority loans to avoid disparate impact. So you'll like this as a science-minded libertarian guy. So on this slide, you'll see that I have a link to an article talking about the demand for hard data and the breakdown of soft data. Do you see that that article and the related?
Yep.
The related images.
Yep, there it is.
So this was part of the pressure that was put on banks that I think it's useful for people to keep in mind. Because one of the threshold questions you asked about last time is, well, wasn't it so obvious that forcing banks to make loans to these enormously high credit risk individuals that they previously weren't able to? Isn't it obvious that they weren't going to make money? Isn't it obvious that they were going to be, that this thing was going to blow up? And you saw an admission by regulators like Andrew Cuomo that even the regulators were aware of this. But what I think is very interesting is the mandatory stupid, that is the death of data that's set in here. So to go through a few quotes from this particular article, it talks about how banks had to throw away all their models that dealt with, quote, soft data because they would not be able to sufficiently explain their discretion and the minutia of it to regulators when it looked like there were hard data discrepancies between racial minorities and white applicants. So, for example, in this article, they talk about how borrowers who are poor credit risks on the dimension of soft information, but apparently creditworthy based on the hard information, have to receive loans. And they give the example of Bank of America, one of the biggest banks in the country, actively upended their mortgage structure in pursuit of getting Community Reinvestment Act credit loans. At one point, they took away the power of its local branch offices to deny loans to minority applicants and sent senior managers from Charlotte in one city to supervise every single mortgage application. And that was as early as 1988, long before the exponential growth of CRA compliance took off during the Clinton administration. So what you're seeing is the squeezing of who can get it and how right before this takes off. So where last we left off, year 2000, Clinton is out of office, and the tech bubble bursts. So on the second to last slide here, the one we went over at the tail end of the last presentation, talks about the NASDAQ bubble bursts and all of the good times of the internet era, the dot-com boom, bust. And there's now bipartisan support between the neocon GOP and the neoliberal media and DNC power players for the same plan, which is made explicit by Paul Krugman in his sort of seminal 2002 New York Times article that the Federal Reserve needs to inflate a housing bubble to replace the tech bubble. Okay, so you guys follow me so far in the, okay. So that sets the stage for the George W. Bush era of what he calls the push to end the gap between white and minority home ownership. So that takes us to the section called The Match. So in here, I want to present a specific hypothesis to you that has ramifications for where we are today and with Donald Trump and the wall and Mexican immigration. See, it was not until 2016 that there was any real support for the idea that that diversity politics might need to have a brake applied to them, because the GOP went all in on trying to lock in the Hispanic vote. And they did that really beginning in 1996, 1998, when they ousted Pat Buchanan from the Republican Party. And with it went all semblance of resistance to the considerations of the white majority in America demographically, because they were being replaced and the GOP had to adapt or evolve. And that's why you saw, for example, everyone who contested Trump in 2016 was Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, either Hispanic or married to Hispanic, and sort of explicitly Hispanic identity politics being embedded within their political campaigns. So what happened was, beginning in 2002, George Bush set about trying to win a twofer, reviving the economy and buying GOP brand loyalty from Hispanic and Black minority groups. So if you go to the next slide here, I'm going to try to present a little bit of evidence for folks to buy into this thesis. So first, George Bush introduces the mega initiative for minority home ownership with two major speeches in 2002. So if you click on the What Could Go Wrong tab, you'll see links to some of these speeches.
Is it the video that's here?
Yeah, but we'll actually play the one on the following slide, because I think it's a little cleaner. Okay. And I've attached transcripts to both of those. So just as a little bit of background, before we get to George Bush's famous initiative that pumped the Community Reinvestment Act to astronomical proportions, here's a little background on George Bush that you probably don't know based on how antagonized he was by the left. George Bush was a very strong supporter of amnesty for illegal immigrants. He was 10 of the 17 cabinet positions were to non-white minorities. So, and I have the data there for those who'd like to see the specific breakdown. So remember, a president gets to appoint 17 cabinet positions. And George Bush, 4 of those were to African Americans, 3 of those were to Hispanics, 2 of those were to Asians, and 1 was to a Middle Eastern Arab American. So that is more than 50% to racial minorities of the czars, the head regulators in charge of the cabinet that oversees enforcement of the law. George Bush also sided with the court in the famous New York firefighters case upholding the disparate impact ruling. So George Bush was a proponent of disparate impact legal doctrine. So now if you turn to that slide saying the plan is literally on record, and if you press play on that and then start beginning at 10:44, this was a speech to the White House Conference on Minority Home Ownership. So if you just play the first couple minutes of the speech, I want you to get it'll give you a ballpark of the size of the racial homeowner initiative that George Bush set in motion.
And thank them for their hospitality. I want to, because it helps the American people really understand what it means. And what we've got to do is to figure out how to make sure these stories are repeated over and over and over again in America. 3/4 of white America owns their homes. Less than 50% of African Americans are part of the home ownership in America, and less than 50% of the Hispanics who live here in this country own their home. And that has got to change for the good of the country. Just does. And so here are some of the ways to address the issue. First, the single greatest barrier to first-time home ownership is a high down payment. It is really hard for many, many low-income families to make the high down payment. And so that's why I've proposed and urged Congress to fully fund the American Dream Down Payment Fund. This will use money, taxpayers' money, to help a qualified low-income buyer make a down payment. And that's important. If one of the barriers to home ownership is the inability to make a down payment, and if one of the goals is to increase home ownership, it makes sense to help people pay that down payment. We believe that the amount of money in our budget, fully approved by Congress, will help 40,000 families every year realize the dream of owning a home. Part of the success of Park Place is that the city of Atlanta already does this. And we want to make the plan more robust. We want to make it more full all across America. Secondly, there is a lack of affordable housing in certain neighborhoods. Too many neighborhoods, especially in inner city America, lack affordable housing units. How can you promote home ownership if people can't afford the home? And so what I've done is propose what we call a single-family affordable housing tax credit to encourage the development of affordable housing in neighborhoods where housing is scarce. Over 5 years, the initiative amounts to $2.4 billion in tax credits. And that'll help. It'll help a lot to build homes where people can, where when fully implemented, people will be able to say, I own my home. A third major barrier is the complexity and difficulty of the home buying process. There's a lot of fine print on these forms. And it bothers people. It makes them nervous.
George Bush has such an elementary school way of phrasing everything. It's amazing. I think that's what led him to become a president.
And so therefore, what Mel has agreed to do and Alfonso Jackson have agreed to do is to streamline the process, make the rules simpler so everybody understands what they are, make the closing much less complicated. We certainly don't want there to be a fine print preventing people from owning their home. We can change the print, and we've got to. We've got to be wise about how we deal with the closing documents and all the regulations, but also wise about how we help people understand what it means to own their home and the obligations and the opportunities. And so therefore, education is a critical component of increasing ownership throughout America. Financial education, housing counseling, how to help people understand that there are unscrupulous lenders, And so one of the things we're going to do is we're going to promote education, the education of owning a home, the education of buying a home throughout our society.
Frame Games, you're making me discover that George Bush was a SJW. I had no clue.
Yes.
He's talking about education like a SJW.
Yes. Well, that's that. Welcome to the neocon conservative, the heart of neocon conservatism.
Did you want to watch more of it?
Yeah. Well, let me read to you some of the. Let's go over some of the words from the speeches so that you don't necessarily need to watch the whole thing. I can show you. I can show you what exactly was said here. That was part, sort of a big part of the plan. So if you go to the next one, the next slide, it's saying the plan is literally on record. And you'll see an image that he gives here. This was in the second speech that he did, which was to the employees and executive staff of HUD. Remember, the organization we went over that enforces the Community Reinvestment Act, and I'm sorry, the Fair Housing Act, that is housing and urban development. So here in this speech, he says, the problem is we have what is called a home ownership gap in America. 3/4 of Anglos own their homes, yet less than 50% of African Americans and Hispanics do. And we need to do something about it. So I've set a goal for the country. We want 5.5 million more homeowners by 2010, million more minority homeowners by 2010. So this is an explicitly racial goal, right? This is not like low income. This is minority, racial minority.
Okay? And I love that the whites gets to be called Anglos.
Yeah,
they're
right?
not really white. They're just the normal Anglos of the U.S.
Right. I mean, and what about the Germanics? And I mean, it's hilarious that says it that way. It's not even accurate. But right. And then he says, and remember this part, okay? By all of us, I mean not only the federal government, but the private sector as well. And so I want to, one, encourage you to do everything you can to work in a realistic, smart way to get this done. I repeat, we're here for a reason. I'm going to do my part by setting the goal, reminding people of the goal, heralding the goal, and calling people into action, both at the federal, state, local, and in the private sector. So this is remember, 2002, a full-scale mobilization at every single level of government and in the private sector to make damn sure that 5.5 million more homes go into the hands of racial minorities.
With a set goal for 2010. And interestingly, we are after 2010. So we're able to evaluate how it worked.
Right. So, and remember, what he calls for here is an end to down payments, right? So down payments are the things that you do. It is a banking requirement that 10% or 20% of the price of the home is paid for upfront by the homeowner. And the reason this is done is not only to as a credit check to make sure that the person has enough money to pay for the 30-year, pay for the value of the home through a 30-year mortgage, but also to make it so that people don't walk away from the home and default on their mortgage because they've already paid a large amount up front, so that they have skin in the game. Right? If you haven't made any down payment, then it's no different from renting. Yeah. You can just walk away at any time, and all you've put in is what you've paid to date. It's one of the key distinguishers economically of renting and owning a home is that barrier that shows that you're serious. So he talks about how he's called upon the private sector to get rid of down payments, to loosen their credit standards, to come up with flexible credit solutions for minority home owners. And he talks about how he's proud to report that Fannie Mae, an organization we're going to get to, has heard his call and is using $440 billion of their influence to create capital available for the type of home buyer we're talking about here. And you know who that is, right? That is explicitly racial minorities. So again, if you're a Martin Luther King guy, like bells should be going off here, like, $440 billion for explicitly racial programs. This, if you really were concerned about the poor, you'd make this about low income, not about race. So, and then you'll see on the next page, he talks about how they're going to now use Section 8 housing vouchers to help with rent. Now, if you remember, this is exactly what we went over at the very beginning of the presentation, where banks used to require income from having a job in order to give a loan. Now you can be on welfare assistance, and under George Bush, your Section 8 housing vouchers, that is your welfare, the amount you receive in federal assistance, banks are going to be required to accept that as supermarkets payments. I mean, it's pretty amazing, right? I mean, that's like how supermarkets sometimes allow EBT or food stamp payments. This is basically housing food stamps that are given to people to own a home. And how George Bush personally, from the highest levels of governments, encouraging the lending industry to develop a mortgage market so that Section 8 housing vouchers can be regularly used as a source of payment to provide capital to lenders. And then later on, he says, I issued a challenge last June to everyone involved in the housing industry to help increase the number of minority families to be homeowners. And what I'm talking about your bankers, your brokers, and your developers, as well as members of the faith-based community and community programs. And this is, remember, as early as 2002, he's saying that he's already gotten 22 public and private partners to help sign up to meet the national goal of 5.5 million new minority loans. Partners in the mortgage finance industry are encouraging home ownership by purchasing more loans made by banks to African Americans, Hispanics, and other minority communities. Representatives of the real estate and home building industries, through their nationwide networks or affiliates, are committed to broadening home ownership, including Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who we'll get to in a second here. So this is a massive public-private, coalition to not just make these loans, but for the whole secondary market to buy bad loans that are initially originated to these bad credit risks that would not otherwise have been made, so that everyone starts having to buy up these loans during the securitization process we'll talk about, in order to get CRA credit, in order to get credit so that they have a satisfactory rating.
So that's what I was about to ask. Did he impose this with a new law, or he just decided to be generous on CRA credits and give them to those people who were adhering to his plan?
Yeah, well, this was how the CRA was enforced through HUD and through Freddie Mac, and we'll meet the characters who enforced that and what their view was towards that. But yes, the answer was George Bush used the Clinton-era Community Reinvestment Act, as amended in 1995, to force all parts of the mortgage industry, not just the banks, but the secondary buyers, to buy up these loans that were terrible credit risks, and to issue subprime loans, primarily to racial minorities, in order so that everybody could get federal housing credit, affordable housing credits that would greenlight their business with the regulators who were tasked with enforcing these racial quotas. So, if you move on here to the next slide, we'll meet the team. So, just to put this in perspective, so we're talking about, from 2002, a new federal and private mandate for 5.5 million new Black and Hispanic homeowners. when at the time between 30 and 40% of Black and Hispanic families were in homes that they were in some form of equity ownership of. And I had their statistics on the numbers of millions of people who were Black and Hispanic in the year 2000. So this is a huge proportion of the national population that is going to be given a home essentially one way or another. So now let's meet the regulators themselves. Okay, so here on the sixth slide here, you'll see Mel Martinez. So in these speeches that Bush gives, he credits Mel Martinez and Alphonso Jackson for enforcing this regulatory goal. So Mel Martinez was the first ever Hispanic head of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And it's no surprise that everyone who was in charge with regulating this was either a African American or Hispanic individual who had eerie similarities to the way that Al Sharpton and others, their loyalties are purchased or they're put out as frontmen for going through with the diversity goals and rubber stamping the diversity goals of these white or Jewish power brokers on top of them. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of what their views were on these Hispanic issues, you can play the clips there beginning on Meet Bush's Cabinet. I think it's slide 7 there.
All right.
Senator Martinez, as you know, politics is about keeping score. I know this is tough for you to hear probably, but you were 0 for 3 last Tuesday. Right. You're a Republican. You are from Florida. That went to the Democrats. And you're Hispanic or Latino in some parts of this country. And the Hispanics went overwhelmingly for the Democrats this time. Jill Lawrence wrote in USA Today, if the Republicans don't make their peace with Hispanic voters, they're not going to win presidential elections anymore. The math just isn't there. That's according to Simon Rosenberg, head of the NDN, Democratic group that studies Hispanic voters. How do you get back to the Hispanics?
Governor Jeb Bush, former Governor Jeb Bush last week made a comment that if Republicans don't figure it out and do the math, that we're going to be relegated to minority status. I've been preaching this for a long time to my colleagues within my party. I think that the very divisive rhetoric of the immigration debate set a very bad tone for our brand as Republicans. The fact of the matter is, I think in Florida there was not a great ideological shift, but I think there was plenty of room for improvement in how that state was looked upon. The fact of the matter is that Hispanics are going to be a more and more vibrant part of the electorate, and the Republican Party had better figure out how to talk to them. We had a very dramatic shift between what President Bush was able to do with Hispanic voters, where he won 44% of them, and what happened to Senator McCain. Senator McCain did not deserve what he got. He was one of those that valiantly fought for immigration reform, but there were voices within our party, frankly, which if they continue with that kind of rhetoric, anti-Hispanic rhetoric, that so much of it was heard, we're going to be relegated to minority status.
Okay, so this is just a little bit of insight. That was obviously in 2012, but it shows you a little bit of behind the scenes of the tension between those in the Republican establishment who believe that the answer to winning as a Republican Party in the future is solidifying the Hispanic vote versus asserting some of the interests of the Anglo majority, if you will. So the next clip there also shows you, the clip on the right shows you a little bit more about Mel Martinez. Remember, Mel Martinez is the guy who George Bush puts into power as the head of housing and urban development until he steps down and is replaced by the next gentleman we'll meet.
So I would just say to you that the Hispanic vote is going to be vitally important in this upcoming election, and I think it already has been, even as we see the primaries evolve. In the year 2000, George Bush received about 35% of the Hispanic vote. In 2004, he received 44% of the Hispanic vote. And I would dare say to you that whoever is going to be the next president of the United States is going to have to receive somewhere in the vicinity of 50% of the Hispanic vote in order to become president. So it's a interesting election year. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch it all evolve and develop. But I also believe that you as Hispanic leaders have a unique opportunity to keep communities informed, to participate in the process, to help others to participate by encouraging people to sign up and to vote. And obviously the mother's milk of politics is money, so also writing checks, because that is...
Okay. You with me so far?
Also writing checks? What was that comment?
He's saying you guys, the Hispanic leadership, also need to contribute more money to the Republican Party in order to make sure that the Republican Party protects your interests going forward.
This is a racial takeover of the democratic process. I've been talking about it in theoretical terms, talking about the future, but it already happened 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and it's actually pretty amazing how it all shakes out. So let's go on to the next slide here. Actually, I think it's slide 9. You might need to refresh. It's called "I'll Buy You a House If You Vote for Me." And it just shows a little, there's an image saying compared to 1999. Let me know if you're, you might need to refresh to get there.
Okay.
Yeah, you might need to.
All right, let's go back
and
to it.
This talks about loans to Hispanic minorities in the year between 1999 and 2006.
All right, it's refreshing. Is it after? Okay, this one. That's what I have here, and I just refreshed. I'll buy you a house if you vote for me, and there's a video.
Oh, is there one on the next page? If you go to the next page, there's one as well, and if not, I can just read it to you out loud.
That's what I have here. The text compared to 1999, the first year in the federal database.
Yep. So what you'll see here is remember, 1999 was Clinton era, like racial minority advocacy under the Community Reinvestment Act and other programs. But look at how George Bush doubled down on it, okay? Between 1999 and 2006, there was a 691% increase in loans to Hispanics. So in 7 years, right, in all of human history, you're up to 21 billion in 1999, and then George Bush, as part of the federal, state, local, and private initiative to end the racial gap in minority home ownership, within 7 years, there's a 700% increase in loans to Hispanic Americans.
Amazing.
I mean, that's a stunning amount. So that's why I say this is, I'll buy you a house if you vote for me. Now, if you see, the 4 heavily Hispanic states of California, Florida, Arizona, and Nevada accounted for 50% of the mortgage defaults in America in 2007.
And were they strategic states electorally?
Yeah, well, these are some of the largest Hispanic represented states in the country. California, obviously, California is number 1. Florida, because of how people move to South Florida from either from Cuba or from Mexico. Arizona and Nevada. These are 4 states, 50% of mortgage defaults.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see that also African Americans in that 7-year stretch, 400% increase in loans. So 400 and 700% respectively, as part of George Bush's drive to end the gap facilitated through subprime mortgages for people who otherwise would not be able to meet traditional loan standards. So Mel Martinez leaves HUD in 2004 in order to run for senator. So we're going to meet now Alphonso Jackson, the George Bush appointee who was put in charge of HUD and therefore Community Reinvestment Act, Banking and Diversity Act considerations from 2004 until he had to resign in disgrace amid ethics investigations in 2008. Okay, so are you with me here?
Absolutely.
This is meet Alphonso Jackson. So Alphonso Jackson, just to give you, and again, you're going to see echoes of that Al Sharpton, GOP racial attack dog phenotype here. Alphonso Jackson made a speech in 2006, again, monologuing. He admits this on record, talking about how a prospective HUD contractor made a heck of a proposal to Housing and Urban Development for a federal contract. But after thanking Jackson, the head of HUD, for selecting him as a bidder, mentioned that he didn't like President Bush. As a result, Jackson said the bidder who had criticized Bush did not receive the federal contract. And here's what he says: "Brother, you have a disconnect. The president is elected. I was selected. You wouldn't be getting the contract unless I was sitting here. If you have a problem with the president, don't tell the secretary," Jackson told the crowd. He didn't get the contract. Why should I reward someone who doesn't like the president so that they can use funds to campaign against the president? Well, it wasn't funds to campaign against the president. It was funds for housing and urban development. Logic says they don't get the contract. That's the way I believe. Now, this, among many other ethics violations, shows you a little bit of an insight into the character of the kinds of Black and Hispanic frontmen appointees that Bush put in place to run his minority home ownership drive. They were those who would also protect him from all criticism. And by the way, you're not allowed to do this. Government contracts are supposed to be nonpartisan, right? It doesn't matter what your opinions are on the president. It's supposed to go to the best bidder for the contract. Mm-hmm. But here you have the head of HUD himself saying, hey, if you don't toe the line, unless you submit to the dictatorial authority of George W. Bush, you ain't getting government money. Now, what's very interesting about what happened with HUD over the course of Alfonso's reign here is that HUD was always the crown jewel of government corruption and was always on the high risk list of the U.S. Government Authority Accountability Office's list of bad government organizations, ones who were perennially in trouble financially and meeting budget constraints and whatnot. But because of this big housing boom from 2002 until 2007, HUD was actually removed from the high risk list, even though it was turned out to be ground zero of corruption here. So let's move on to the next slide here, just to give you a little bit of insight into who the government regulators are that were running the Bush regime here. So here, and this is just from Wikipedia, this was the minority contracting. So forget about minority loans and minority secondary subprime loans, secondary issuances and purchases. This is just what's going on at HUD itself. Okay. Jackson increased minority, women, and small business contracting substantially during his tenure. In 2003, the year before Jackson was named secretary, 14%, or $134 million, of HUD's contracts went to Black-owned firms. Now, that alone should set off some alarm bells about what's going on here at HUD. Blacks represent only 13% of the U.S. population. And because of a variety of totally non-racial factors relating to ownership of wealth, proportion of outstanding firms who own businesses in the minority space, far less than 13%, the fact that even coming into Jackson's reign, they were above the national average, despite being far underrepresented in number of firms and quality of grade A or triple A rated firms. They were already receiving a substantial amount of affirmative action to be above their national average in representation. But check this out. By 2007, that is in the 4 years of Alfonso's reign, Black-owned businesses were receiving 25% of HUD's federal contracts. Okay, so only 13% of the population, but because of this drive to put more and more business into explicitly Black-owned firms, 25%, double their national representation for majority Black-owned businesses getting these contracts. So is this something that does this sound like familiar to you? Did you have any idea that this was going on during the Bush administration?
Not at all, but it sounds like imposed overrepresentation.
Yes, this is imposed overrepresentation, but remember that all of this is part of a pay for play. Remember that these folks are who gets installed here plays into how well received and promoted George Bush and his administrators are within the Black and Hispanic communities. So there is a drive to install folks who are going to satisfy these community organizations and the metrics that are set from the top down about having racial quotas. So 25% federal contracts to Black-owned business is a pretty astounding number. I've never seen something that high. And when you combine that with Jackson's, going out in flames disgrace with all the kickbacks that he received, one can only speculate about how much Jackson received as in pay for play from these organizations to personally finance or put money in Jackson's pocket in order for receipt of federal funding. So here you go. It continues. This accomplishment led a federal investigation and caused some to think Jackson was wrongly targeted because of his efforts. Indeed, some of his supporters derided the scrutiny of his casual friendships as a racist effort to undermine a prominent Black official, and several respected Black businessmen noted that no one had been formally charged with the crime.
That is a recurring observation. It is a recurring observation when you go after a case of fraud of a Black man. You're a racist.
That's exactly right. So here's James Kleinberg, number 3 Democrat, ranking Democrat in the House, said he believed the investigation into Jackson for racial pay to play was fueled by officials determined to derail Jackson's efforts to expand affirmative action. Is there something wrong with trying to make sure African Americans participate in the contracting program with the American government? In 2010, the Justice Department dropped its charges against Jackson, saying that they were unable to find sufficient evidence about quid pro quo. Nevertheless, in 2008, he resigned amid considerable investigative investigations into exactly this, some of which we'll cover here briefly in a minute. But look at the straw man that they use here. It's not about, no one has a problem with trying to ensure participation. What you have a problem with is racial preference systems. Mm-hmm. And when you have a group that's only 13% of the population, and likely a very small fraction of that with respect to reputable firms that are Black owned, not just racial minority, but specifically Black owned businesses in the housing industry, to have 25% of federal contracts going to explicitly Black-owned businesses is astounding, because that's not even Hispanic-owned. That's just Black. So to understand a little bit about how deep the rabbit hole goes with Alfonso Jackson, go ahead and pull up that link to Alfonso Jackson's blog spot. Do you see that at the bottom of that of that slide there? I thought this was sort of interesting when I was doing a little bit of diligence on Alfonso Jackson. He started a blog spot in 2011, around the time that personal blogging on the internet was kind of getting big with these free blogging sites and
such a good old days. But he has only one post. Oh, did we lose Frame Game? Hello, Frame Game. I think we lost you. Alright, well, if we lost Frame Game, I'm gonna read some super chat. Aussie News Network says $50 again. Thank you so much, Aussie. He says more JF and Frame Games, shekels for both. John Murphy says ultimately various parents, Skin Essential, Comptroller, Helicopter, Heliopolis, hello. I don't know what that means. I guess it's a reference to what we were talking about last week with Frame Games. Fernando Covet says, does Frame Games has clips of Peter Schiff on the bubble? I think he may have some. I think he may have shown us some things about Peter Schiff. And Radio GI
Take him
says,
back if you can hear me.
Alright. Frame Games is back. I'm gonna read the last super chat. Radio GI says, keeping it short and sweet. I plan to start a right-wing radio station. Could we talk about rebroadcasting both your own and Frame Games' excellent work? I don't object to it, but I'm not fascinated by this. I would say if you can bring creative content, don't just replay stuff that people have access on YouTube. It's not that I object strongly to it. I think it's good to share, but if you're starting in the business, work out your brain and try to find something you can do that others can't. Alright, Frame Game, so we were on the blog spot of Alfonso Jackson. Now, in 2011, is that while he is at the HUD? Is that after?
No, that was after. So we'll talk about some of the Jewish connections to this in a minute here. You didn't think we could go a whole series without me as your friendly liaison here. Talking about, if we're talking about the diversity industry and ethnic considerations, I think it's only fair that everybody's attribution gets rightfully debited in the accounting. This was in 2007. 2011, after Jackson's out of office. But I thought this was interesting to go over because it is the one article that Alfonso Jackson ever published on his blog spot, and it's entitled "Black Americans Should Support Their Real Friends."
I feel some echoes in those real friends.
You don't say. It happens to be pulsing with it. Basically, what it's about is how organized Black leadership needs to do a better job of supporting Jewish leadership, and that with the intersectional warfare that was going on at the time with respect to the key Obama administrators and the Jewish community with respect to Israel. If you remember, there was a lot of talk about Obama being the worst president ever for Israel. And this was Alfonso Jackson's impassioned plea for as a bipartisan appeal to left-wingers and right-wingers within the Black community to do a better job of standing by their real friends, the Jews. So
it's so fascinating that you would think of making this as his first post. It really shows what's on his mind.
Man. Well, the rabbit hole goes a bit deeper there because it turns out that Alfonso Jackson is very deeply tied into the New York Jewish real estate political industrial complex, if you will. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour there because it helps understand a part of what's driving the minority mortgage priorities that were going on at the time. So here's a little background. And by the way, you'll be mindful of the fact that one of the things that distinguishes the neocon GOP establishment from the Pat Buchanan Reform Party, sort of Anglo interests with respect to immigration, is specifically Jewish support. So the single biggest reason that Pat Buchanan was kicked out of the Republican Party between 1996 and 1998 was because of allegations that he and his plan to end immigration, Hispanic immigration, had anti-Semitic overtones to it. And it was the Jewish Republican money being threatened to be pulled from the GOP that played a significant role in the GOP ultimately kicking out the anti-immigration forces. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that background, but those who are familiar with Pat Buchanan, this will be a familiar story to those involved here. So it's important to, keep in mind. I'm sure JF, you're familiar with the neocon origins and Jewish support for neocon GOP.
In general, but I'm not aware about Pat Buchanan.
Okay, well, maybe we can go over that a bit later if we have time. But so Alphonso Jackson is the sort of neocon Friends of Israel, black GOP frontman here, if you will. So here's a little tour of that. So 1994, Alphonso Jackson wins the Jewish National Fund's National Tree of Life Award. So if things are starting to feel a little bit creepy to you right now, this is here on the next slide, the one with awards and whatnot on it. So the Jewish National Fund is one of the oldest Jewish institutions affiliated with making the state of Israel happen. The JNF, the Jewish National Fund, owns 13% of all land in Israel. And they were the fund that was set up in 1908 to buy up land for Jews to live in Israel in order to create a shadow government and substantial enough Jewish representation such that when the Balfour Declaration's promises rang true, there was already a sufficiently large number of Jewish people there in order to have a nation state, a Jewish nation state, be formed. You following me so far? That's the Jewish National Fund.
All right.
Okay, absolutely huge, but like the number one Jewish real estate money in the world, and they have something called the Tree of Life Award, which goes to it's the highest humanitarian award that the Jewish National Fund can award to an individual or family each year in appreciation for their outstanding community involvement and dedication to the American-Israeli friendship and in industry, government, and education. So Alphonso Jackson, of all people, was Jewish National Fund Tree of Life Award winner.
Mm-hmm.
So now, what's really interesting is the alliance between Alphonso Jackson. It's very tempting to think that okay, here he is. He is a Republican appointee, a Bush appointee, and you have all these bipartisan initiatives in government, and it just so happens that Alphonso Jackson has some very interesting connections to high-ranking Jewish leadership in both the GOP and in the DNC. And, if you just run an internet search for Alphonso Jackson's various approvals and accolades by various Jewish organizations, they are absolutely extensive, including, grants for, tens of millions of dollars at least in various Jewish senior housing and Jewish neighborhoods. He is the sort of favorite of Chuck Schumer, who you may know as the head of the DNC. To this day, Chuck Schumer is one of the most powerful Democratic senators in Congress. And Alphonso Jackson was a regular speaker, contributor, and sort of public face of the Metropolitan Jewish Poverty Council in New York, which is one of the largest New York charities, and one that went down in absolute flames for its ridiculous levels of corruption that were uncovered in about between 2007 and 2010. 2012. In fact, they actually renamed themselves from the Metropolitan Council on Jewish Poverty to just the Metropolitan Council, to remove sort of Jewish affiliations with this organization that was explicitly dedicated to helping the 300,000 Jewish individuals who are poor in America. So, these ethnic identity politics groups are not just for wealthy Jewish individuals. They're also for folks sort of below the poverty line. Although, unfortunately, a lot of that money that they receive, which is billions of dollars, actually is basically grants. It's basically they get federal and state grant money to alleviate Jewish poverty that actually finds its way into the coffers of the wealthiest Jewish representatives in the country. So can show you on a little tour here on the next page if you want to see what ended up happening to these groups that Alphonso Jackson was helping funnel money to. So I think you can start with maybe and any one of those links will do, and we can cover them. But you'll see that the Clintons. So this is one of these sort of bipartisan organizations that helped explain part of the overlap between the Clinton and Bush administrations. So, for example, Bush helped keep Franklin Raines and other Clinton appointees in the housing space as running the Bush-era regulations as well. But let's see, if we click on, maybe the bottom, actually, let's go to on the slide after this. There's a bunch of good links here from the New York Post. And okay, yeah, that'll work too. So here's basically the way this worked. So this guy Sheldon Silver is said to be the most powerful person in all of New York State because he runs New York City real estate, and he was the head of the New York City State Assembly. So he is the guy that every local community group needs to influence in order to get regulatory authority from the city of New York, from their legislature. Mm-hmm. So he was buddy-buddy with the guy who runs the Jewish Metropolitan Council that Alphonso Jackson gives all his regulatory approvals so that they get money for all their housing initiatives. And let's see if there's a pretty good link here that I will show you that takes a bit of a tour on it. But as you would expect, Sheldon Silver there have been many attempts to take him down, and he was on trial for corruption claims that totaled 130 years in prison. But he was found guilty, convicted of all 7 counts of corruption. And then in 2 separate times he was convicted, and then it was overturned on appeal. And he was convicted a 3rd time on the same charges and is currently awaiting sentences this September, even though these charges have been going on since I think as far back as 2014. So this should remind you of the untouchable phenomenon, where those who represent Jewish leadership, even if you nail them dead to rights, even if you have them indicted on federal charges, you can convict them multiple times, but the sentences always seem to get thrown out or they get pardoned for inexplicable reasons, and then the pardon is rarely covered in mainstream media. Mm-hmm. So. For some reason, my computer is freezing up a little bit here. It might be my mouse. But you can see how almost comedic this is. There's a link here just give me 1 second. Pull up the one for, if you go to on the page before that, and it talks about how the end of the Sheldon Silver, yeah, there you go, the second one, how, yeah, there you go. And this is an article from Haaretz bemoaning that this Sheldon Silver conviction may be the end of Jewish political domination of New York City, that the ruler of New York State Assembly is now facing 130 years in prison for corruption. Okay, it looks like, are you able to access that without a membership?
No, yeah, you need to be a member.
Here's a little secret. If you just type in, if you delete the S from HTTPS in the beginning, and then you type in www.outline.com / after the HTTP, you can access all these articles. But if that's too much of a pain, you can go back and I'll show you another article that does a good job of explaining it. And that shows you the mass appeal of the New York Jewish community to try to clear Sheldon Silver.
Yeah, I have it here.
Okay. So, this article does a pretty good job of showing this, New York City kingpin and the relationship with with Jewish power players and how they explicitly used a Jewish law firm and disguised payments as being law referrals when they were actually kickbacks for bribes, and how a lot of this was for basically pay to play to get approvals for real estate development contracts in the tens of millions of dollars. And we can come back to this if you like, but there's another one that I think is very interesting that I linked to. It's the last link in the slide. That is another Haaretz article, and it's Jewish leaders seek leniency for Rap Fogel.
Page not found, unfortunately.
That one, here, actually, if you let me send you the direct link for it. I think it's because it's pulling up the text that's next to it. So here you go. Let me send you the link in the lobby here, because this really shows, it really dovetails very nicely with other presentations we've done that shows what happens when a member of a Jewish identity politics organization is thrown in prison. Okay, great. It looks like you've got it pulled up. Can you see the whole article when you scroll down?
Yep.
Okay. So if you go through this article, do you remember how previously we've covered what happens when, say, Jewish spies like Jonathan Pollard get convicted of federal crimes and should be in jail for life? Do you remember we covered Jonathan Pollard, the spy who stole nuclear secrets, and how he was ultimately pardoned?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then remember, the same thing happened with Mark Rich, who was pardoned by Bill Clinton on his last day in office after being lobbied by every major Jewish community leader, including the Holocaust Remembrance Museum.
Yep.
To clear this white-collar criminal of his crimes, not even arguing that he's innocent, JF, just arguing that the man has suffered enough. And he's a good boy. He didn't do nothing. He suffered enough. We want leniency. So go ahead. If you read this article, you can see how deep the rabbit hole goes with how much they protect their own. So if you scroll down, you'll see who's asking for leadership. So here, among the letters in support of the Jewish, this is the organization that Jackson is the best that the Bush appointee was BFF with. Okay. This is Howard Friedman, the president of AIPAC. Richard Stone, the ex-chair of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish American Organizations. Remember, that's AIPAC for presidents. You have, the chair of the Claims Conference. And if you don't know, the Conference of Jewish Material Claims Against Germany is the major worldwide Jewish organization that shakes down, it basically makes sure that money from every organization affiliated with World War II continues to send its billions to first, second, third, and fourth generation Holocaust survivors. So you have every major Jewish lobbying group that should otherwise have nothing to do with New York City real estate, as well as dozens of high-ranking rabbis from across the city, all issuing joint letters that even though this man has been convicted, even though you've got guilty pleas in hand, he still needs lenience, and he should get the minimum sentencing amount. So, of course, he's let out of jail. I think he's sentenced to 10 years. He gets out after about, I think, 18 months, on good behavior, and that's it. You can, tens of millions of dollars that you scrape off the edge. You get minimum security and out on good behavior, as soon as possible. So, just shows you a little bit of the connections there between our friends in the neocon GOP political establishment and sort of Jewish New York real estate. But we can come back to this.
The entire system is corrupt. We're fucked. This is so black-pitting.
But remember, this was pre-Trump era. So some of this has changed. So another person who was BFF with the Jewish Israeli New York City power player state is a holdover from the Clinton era, the man who ran Fannie Mae. Oh, so by the way, you'll see here that one of the things that Alphonso Jackson ultimately went down in flames for is that he got money from Angelo Mozillo in the Friends of Angelo program, whereby, and if this name sounds familiar, if you remember, we've gone over this name. Angelo Mozillo is actually one of the reasons that we're doing this talk. We went over it briefly in part one. Angelo Mozillo was the king of the world from 2003 to 2006 as being the world's foremost benefactor of African-American and Hispanic homeowners, because he was the CEO of Countrywide Financial, the world's number one most prolific lender to on diversity, minority empowerment reasons.
He was the self-made man who became a billionaire just by respecting minorities and having the genius idea of giving loans to minorities and respecting them.
Right, exactly. Now, what's very interesting about Angelo Mozillo is that Countrywide Financial actually got dinged in 1992 in a racial discrimination lawsuit for not providing enough loans to racial minorities. This was in 1992. And then what they discovered upon Clinton's election in 1992, a genius idea. What if they actually went 180 the opposite way and became the most prolific lender to racial minorities in the world? So Alphonso Jackson was caught up in this scandal because he received special discount loans from Countrywide as part of a Friends of Angelo program for regulators and senators who pushed through, who helped basically get the regulations in place that protected Countrywide, and as a quid pro quo, they got discount mortgages for their second homes, their summer homes. So Alphonso Jackson went down in part for that, and so did Franklin Raines, the head of Fannie Mae. So let me know if you need to pause for anything here. We're going to talk for a minute here about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who were the two GSEs, the government-sponsored enterprises, who were tasked with maintaining liquidity in the mortgage lending market by buying loans and helping purchase assets of banks so that banks would have enough liquidity to continue making loans.
All right, so let's just read two super chats before we do that. Otaku Bullfrod says, I didn't think I could like Bush even less. And Robert Paulson, $10, he says, this shit is so heavy. It's so deeply ingrained. It takes one hyper autist to even map it. how would one even begin to fight against it?
Well, I'll tell you this: keep voting Trump is a good start. We'll get into some of the Trump connections to all of this, but remember, we're on the other side of this history right now, and things are definitely bad. Like, no mistake. Like, there is a mountain of fight ahead of us, but there are a lot of victories along this, and what Trump represents is a victory against the neocon establishment. Trump didn't just beat Clinton. He beat the fucking Bush dynasty. And this happened not just because of Clinton. It happened because the GOP was convinced the only way they could win is if they win 50% or more of the Hispanic vote. And what happened was Trump came along and showed, you know what, there's still life in white America. And if that trend continues, then you could see a reduction in the total power of the diversity industry, and we'll get to more of that at the end. But let's just say that there's a lot of victories here on the battlefield for us right now.
All right. Do we watch the video, or do we look at your slide?
I wanted to set up for a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time talking about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac because it's very complicated financial shit. Like, one of the reasons that this wasn't as explosive as it should have been is because it takes a little bit of a financial background to understand how the sausage is made. But let's just say, as a libertarian, it's important to keep in mind that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were private. They're called government-sponsored enterprises. They are private enterprises that basically have government sponsorship over them in order to provide liquidity to banks so that they basically buy assets off of bank balance sheets so that banks can lend more. Now, remember, banks are originating these bad loans, and you now have this quasi-governmental entity that is relieving the banks of a substantial portion of their liabilities because they're buying them from them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're wondering about these greedy bankers and they're so predatory, taking advantage of these racial minorities, and well, it is the government sponsored entities who are disproportionately being saddled with these bad loans because they're buying them in part as the drive for minority home ownership. They're saying, we don't care. We know that these are risky loans. We know that they're subprime loans who are majority to racial minorities like blacks and Hispanics who don't otherwise meet prime lending standards. We know that you got rid of down payments. We know that you got rid of certain FICO score requirements and your soft data. But don't worry, you keep on lending to them because we'll buy the liabilities from you. Okay, now that happened through a process called securitization. There was a big CTME Act that was passed in 2000 to facilitate this. Glass-Steagall, a bunch of other shit, gets into that aspect of it. It's a little bit beyond the scope of it. But suffice it to say that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bought Countrywide loans so that the risk was not just on Countrywide. It spread through the entire financial sector because these toxic loans that were done to promote minority home ownership became spread through the entire system because of pressure on these federal regulators and federal sponsored GSEs to buy these loans and make sure that they proliferated. So we're now going to meet the folks who were in charge of these GSEs. So we're going to start with Franklin Raines, who was the head of Fannie Mae. So if you play this clip does a good job of setting up who Angelo Mozillo was.
Very tight.
And how Angelo Mozillo is sort of the fall guy for the 2008 financial crisis, even though he was, for reasons that they never really talk about for some weird reason. In fact, why don't you play this clip first? This is in 1998, Franklin Raines, back when he was appointed by Bill Clinton.
budget.
Mr. Raines, there are many critics of this program who say that the president's heart is in the right place, but they're not quite convinced that this is the right solution. I know Harry Alford, the president CEO of the National Black Chamber of Commerce, said, you know, we've got all kinds of race-neutral things that really don't do a damn for black businesses. He said further, this is all talk.
Well, I'm not quite sure what he's referring to, but I think these kinds of incentives that try to get businesses to make investments in their own interest, based on their own calculation of what will advance their own interest, is the right way to go. For example, we are very interested in investing through the low-income housing tax credit. Why are we doing that? Because we're in the housing business, and this is a way for us to invest in and create more multifamily housing, and it also helps us continue the viability of communities where we have billions of dollars already invested, and we need to see those communities be stable.
Well, I think what a number of African-American leaders have said, Mr. Raines, is that they're not so much against what the president is targeting, but by making it race neutral. They fear, ironically, that this doesn't help black-owned businesses or minority-owned businesses, and that something that was ultimately earmarked to help them ends up doing diddly for them.
This host is asking for less race neutrality.
And remember, this is Fox News in 1998. This is before the racial. This is before the racial minority home ownership drive, so you know, this just shows you a little bit of the background here. Unless we make it racially explicit, then all of the black leadership is complaining that it's still not enough after all this.
I wonder how he feels about that sentence today.
Well, I don't think that's right. I think the idea that the only way to make investments in the black community is by having race-specific incentives, I think that's a wrong idea. Money in this country is green. It's not white or black or yellow or brown. And it's very important to have these dollars that are being invested geographically where the need is. And if it's invested geographically, if it's invested smart, then the people who are investing, like us, will be working with local groups, working with local entrepreneurs who are black, who are Hispanic, who are Asian. But that will happen as a result, again, of people doing what works and not doing something because it's a government mandate to only work with one group or another.
You know, that's generally the kind of talk the financial community loves to hear, Mr. Raines, and reason enough for there to be growing talk that if Treasury Secretary Rubin, for example, were to step down, as is perennially always argued, you're the perfect man to take his place. How do you feel about that?
Well, my desire is for Bob Rubin to stay Treasury Secretary for life.
What if he doesn't?
If he doesn't, I'm sure the president will find many qualified people, but I'm very happy.
You keep seeming to top that list.
Well, I topped the one list I was interested in, which is the list of people to be CEO of Fannie Mae, and that's where I'm going to be.
So if asked, you'd say no?
All right.
Okay. So I bring that up to show you that this is the guy that there's a reason that, remember, this was a Clinton appointee, and this was before the explicitly racial CRA, like minority home ownership drive, was put in place by Bush. And the reason that Harold Raines was kept in power and kept in check is because the GOP loved that he was able to put a spin on these racial politics that white people could digest very well. You know, it's exactly what Byron Allen alleged against Comcast and AT&T and Al Sharpton and this kind of frontman person. So Franklin Raines went down in flames because he was on the payroll of Angelo Mozillo and received discount summer homes and vacation homes from Countrywide in exchange for Fannie Mae buying up these minority subprime loans from Countrywide. This should be blowing. If this is not making your hair fucking burn right now, stay tuned for how this story plays out. So first, back to normie history, okay? If you look through your CNN files, actually, I think it's the slide before this, the regulators and Angelo Mozillo. This does a pretty good, I think the first minute of it does a decent job of, back back, and it's
Angelo
should
Mazzillo,
be
learning to love the diversity.
It's the one. It should be slide number 16, and it's the. In fact, we can skip by it. That's right. I'll just tell you about what it says. It's that one. But if we're in a rush for time, I can just basically this is Chris Matthews, who at the time was one of the highest rated TV talk show hosts. He ran MSNBC's Hardball, and he goes through how Time Magazine's #1 person most responsible for the financial crisis was Angelo Mozillo, and how he is the devil incarnate. And he goes through what you will read as normie history's version of who's responsible for the financial crisis, and he pins it all on Angelo Mozillo for his greed. But we can skip past that if you like. If you want, you can listen to a minute of it.
I think it's interesting. We can have a look.
Meanwhile, today, President Obama did sign that big spending and tax bill, the biggest in history, to try to steer us out of this economic crisis. But I want to know right now who's responsible for getting in this mess. It's getting time to find out the problem. Time Magazine put together a list, including the usual suspects at the top. They're prime suspects, I should say. Let's take a look at the top of the list right now. The chief executive of Countrywide, Angelo Mozillo, by the way, joining us right now. We've got Krista Freeland of the Financial Times, and we got David Faber, who's with NBC Squawk Box, CNBC Squawk Box. Let's go to these names here. Angelo Mozillo, David, this guy's head of Countrywide. What did he do wrong?
Mozillo, butcher's son, started in the business when he was 14, I think, Chris. What did he do wrong? Well, they were one of the largest providers of subprime loans in the country for quite some time. Listen, he built an incredible business, but ultimately they were part of the machine that was giving people mortgages that ultimately those people could not pay back, and that there may have been quite a few mortgages given to people who couldn't pay them back when they knew very well they weren't going to pay them back. Why would you do that? Well, Countrywide was able to securitize those mortgages, put them in a pool, and sell them almost immediately to investors around the world. That was the chain that ultimately allowed there to be an enormous amount of credit put out there to people who couldn't pay it back.
Countrywide used the access to easy loan money to basically seduce people into buying houses they couldn't afford, right?
Yeah, I mean, listen, nobody cried when they cashed the check, right? And by the way, an important point, a lot of subprime, in fact, more than half of it was for cash-out refinancings. It wasn't for minorities or people who were poor. It was cash-out refinancings for my home because I want to put in a pool or redo my kitchen.
Okay, let's go to your thoughts, Chris.
I think David made a really important...
How they're trying to preempt that. They don't show you the data on how much of that cash-out financing was actually by racial minorities. But even without that, there is when I show you the data on just how many of these foreclosures, what proportion of them were exactly that, you'll see why it is that they don't talk about it, or why they try to, sort of imply racism or use selective data on that front. But let's just take a little bit of a tour here through Angelo Mozillo. So, you'll see on the next slide here, Countrywide Friends Got Good Loans. This is from the Wall Street Journal. And you'll see that Franklin Raines ultimately, went down in flames for exactly that. Or I guess that's on the next slide here. But why don't we go to just as one more piece of setup, there's a 2.5-minute video on pay-to-play and corruption, slide number, that has the CNN clip. I don't know if you see it.
Yep.
But if you play that one, that'll also give a little bit of a background on all this.
When it came to the American dream, no one was better at selling it than Angelo Mozillo. As founder of the mortgage giant Countrywide Financial, Mozillo found ways to put people into houses who never thought they could afford it.
Every one of them was turned down for a home loan by 3 different lenders. I'm with Countrywide, and I got them all approved. All approved. All approved.
Mozillo's Countrywide became the nation's largest originator of subprime mortgages.
As our company did well, I did well, as did our shareholders.
U.S. foreclosure rates are soaring.
Seduced by the low initial interest rates, many were assured they could easily refinance.
Too many people are losing their homes.
Full-blown credit crunch.
We haven't seen anything like this since the Depression.
I have devoted my life to building a mortgage banking company, that focused on extending homeownership opportunities to all Americans, including minority families who had been largely left behind by traditional mortgage lenders.
Do you profit by people losing their homes?
By the billions of dollars that we have written off, the answer is clearly no.
Something doesn't smell right. You run the largest originator of home mortgages in the country. If you don't bear personal responsibility, I don't know who does.
Okay.
He's like one.
Okay, so I just want to provide a little bit of background there so you can see how he's demonized and how little attention is paid to the sort of racial aspect of Mozillow's business strategy, except in the context of him being described as a predatory lender to racial minorities. Mm-hmm. Now, in the aftermath of all this, he was sued by 11 different state attorney generals in connection with reverse redlining, a new legal liability doctrine that was, remember, the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, was put in place and then strengthened ever greater levels, thresholds to get rid of redlining. And then at the end of it, it went so far that you can now be sued for reverse redlining for lending too much and too easily to exactly those neighborhoods. Wow. So on the next slide, here I'm going to take a little tour of the history of Angelo Mozillo that you don't normally see in these profiles. So, and this is the learning to love the diversity industry aspect of it. Now, one of the things they didn't show you in those clips, while they were telling you how bad Countrywide was, remember, it was Fannie Mae who was buying Countrywide's minority subprime loans. So Fannie Mae went bankrupt, Freddie Mac went bankrupt, and then Fannie Mae, and of course they spun it off throughout the entire mortgage industry. All those assets became floating around because they were securitized and then traded on the market because of the liquidity that these GSEs like Fannie Mae had. But they bought these toxic loans because of this relationship between Angelo Mozillo and Franklin Raines, the head of Fannie Mae, who was getting personal kickbacks from Angelo Mozillo. So here you go. Here's an article from 2009 that talks about Mozillo's rise, and they say Mozillo was even more messed up than we thought. In a fresh New Yorker profile on Mozillo, Connie Brook connects his anti-establishment attitude to permanently looking like a tangerine because he is an orange tan. He talks about how at the beginning of his rise to power, Countrywide sent Mozillo to Virginia Beach. But in Virginia Beach, the local club where business people congregated refused to admit him. And in Orlando, he had trouble selling mortgages until he met a group of Jewish home builders who couldn't get financing. So he ends up working with this group of Jewish home builders to basically create a selling to minorities coalition to help basically do he begins his subprime start in coalition with a lot of these Jewish home lenders who were the only people in town who would actually sort of do business with him in the scheme that he hatched after 1992 to eliminate the home ownership gap. Mm-hmm. So if you go to the next image here, you'll see that between 1993, so right away he starts up this program. Between 1993 and 1994, Countrywide, their loans to African Americans rose 325% to Hispanics and 325% to African Americans and 163% to Hispanics in a single year. Okay, now remember, you'll see at the bottom here I have highlighted, Countrywide was funded by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and Angelo Mozillo personally lashed out and used all of his influence to suppress efforts to reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, since without their funding, there'd be no way for Countrywide to compete with more conservative rivals like Wells Fargo. So they needed their shitty loans to be bought by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and I can play you some very interesting montages of all the regulators debating whether or not to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And it falls along exactly the kind of racial lines you would imagine with all of many of the characters who are still with us today. If we have time, I'll get to that later.
All right.
But now I want to show you the good times, Angelo Mozillo and good times. So in the next slide, you'll see a link to a 2013 seminal speech and an article that Mozillo wrote in Closing the Home Ownership Gap, and basically the magician secrets revealed for why it is that Countrywide is kicking everyone's ass right now in 2003, shortly before everybody got on board and adopted the Countrywide model. So here Mozillo cites at the beginning of this, he cites, and I think it's the one before that, we start with, as President Bush said last October. So here he is citing President Bush's minority home ownership gap initiative, and how he's working with President Bush and the federal regulators to close this gap, and how you can take advantage of these federal programs. And then on the next one, you'll see that he's literally spouting the exact same federal language that you heard Bush recite, such as, one of the more obvious resolutions to the money gap is the elimination of down payment requirements for low income and minority borrowers. Now, if this was not racial, why would you even put the word minority in there, right? If this is just about a humanitarian effort to give poor people homes, then you wouldn't use the word minority there. But the fact is, that's what this was. That's what drove it politically, because it was part of the comprehensive urge to drive to win GOP voters over minority GOP voters, and specifically Hispanics, to the GOP. And it worked. In his reelection campaign, George Bush got up to 44% of the Hispanic vote. I mean, totally astounding numbers, because you buy him a house in exchange for the vote. So then, he talks here in the second thing, we must educate the low income and minority sector about their rights and responsibilities of home ownership. Equally important, we must reduce the documentation required to make any and all loans. We should be able to approve loans in minutes rather than days, and close in days rather than weeks. So the problem is there's too much reading that minority groups need to do. We need to get rid of documentation so that minorities don't need to read as much, and then make sure that we can close this shit ASAP, so that there's less red tape about just shoveling this shit through. But it doesn't matter, because Fannie Mae is going to be buying our shit anyway. What's that?
Very much what George Bush was saying in his speech. It's almost as if they're coordinated.
That's weird. It's not like there was a federal directive to literally coordinate within that kickoff speech 4 direct times saying, I repeat, it is critical. I repeat, the private sector. I repeat, you guys. And remember, they're all in the crowd. I mean, and not only that, they're all working together. They're all giving speeches at each other's conferences, and they're all getting kickbacks through the Friends of Angelo program. Mm-hmm. So now let's take another look down perspective lane so you can understand the quantity of money involved. Remember, we started this speech with that infographic on the amount of money in the world, right? Yep. There's only like $5 trillion in cash and only $80 trillion of all cash and all checking accounts in the entire world. Well, just to show you just how big this was. So Countrywide here in 2003, they announced that they are going to make a $600 billion commitment to minority home ownership. And they end up in the subsequent year pushing that up to $1 trillion in that they pledge in their effort for minority home ownership. And who are their partners? Well, just what you would expect. Look at the bottom of the second page. Their partners are the following entities: Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Federal Housing Authority, the Congressional Black Caucus, National Council of La Raza, which is the Hispanic version of the NAACP, the AFL-CIO, which is the largest union in the country, which is basically a huge minority advocate for other reasons, and faith-based groups across the country. And you know what that means by now, I hope. So this is the countrywide coalition. It's the Congressional Black Caucus. That is all the highest-ranking members of who are black legislators in the House and in the Senate. La Raza, the AFL-CIO, and then Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as well as all the faith-based groups like Power, like the NCRCs, like the National Action Network. There it is. They're all in it together, and that's who this $1 trillion pledge is going to. Okay, so I don't know if, and then you'll see at the bottom, he says, I want to specifically and especially recognize Franklin Raines and his entire team at Freddie Mae for providing a great deal of the resources that have made it possible for us to achieve our objectives. So these are the government-sponsored enterprise. Like this is, but people don't blame. You're not going to see these liberals and left-wingers blaming the GSEs because they need them in place in order to keep funneling money into the diversity industry.
That's what was traveling my mind as you were describing Mozilla's downfall. I feel that there is lots of text throwing him under the bus as a scapegoat, but avoiding to make the general symptom analysis that you do.
Well, right. Well, they need the GSEs in place because that is how these groups that are making shitty loans and getting CRA credit for it are able to rest assured that they won't go bankrupt for making these loans. If anyone will, it's Fannie Mae. Mm-hmm. So they need those, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They need those reassurances. And as you know, as I hope I've demonstrated the tip of the iceberg here. These Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are hopelessly corrupt because they are in bed with all of these faith-based groups and diversity activist organizations that lobby for the continued strength of the Community Reinvestment Act and the FHA and all that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I wanted to make that clear there. I think just in the interest of time. And let me know if you need to take another break here. We can skip ahead to the explosion section and sort of talk a little bit about what ended up happening. The damage from this.
Absolutely. Just so we have plenty of time, I think it's good to take a 1-minute break. I have something to do, and I'll be back. And in 1 minute, then we'll have more time, and we finish the episode.
All right, sounds good.
Alright, I'm back. Someone on the regular chat says, Frame, this is gold. Thank you so much for this work. Indeed, it is pretty in-depth.
Yeah, sure thing. Remember to like and share this and spread it around, because this is normie friendly stuff. I mean, I've tried to do a decent job of explaining. Like, it doesn't matter if you are far right or moderately left. If you are a Martin Luther King, race neutral, colorblind person, then this is a larger issue that everybody should be on board with.
Absolutely.
So just wanted to make that clear.
All right. So we have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I can't believe how much you taught me again about these two, because these two things, all I knew about them is I hate them because their name, it sounds like a fraud. It sounds like someone played a game when he made up these names. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. That's all I knew about these two organizations.
Yep. So, well, they are still live to this day. They were preserved after a very hot debate over, and maybe I will actually pull up that clip showing some of the considerations there about some of the debate over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But let's move on now with the explosion section, because I want to run through some statistics just so that you can see I'm not just spouting air at you here. So actually, if you refresh the presentation, I think I added a few slides here at the end just to make sure that we get it covered.
All right. The explosion.
Yeah. So there you'll see, I believe it's in the first one here. If you double click on crash, we already covered the disproportionate defaults there. But if you look at the second image, you'll see that race was actually the number one indicator for whether or not there was a default from the 2007 financial crisis. So here in just one county, I have some of the data showing that even among high-income neighborhoods, Black borrowers are 42% more likely to default, and Hispanics were 159% more likely to default than white neighborhoods, even the high-income ones, which shows you just how sort of bent over backwards there was to make sure that the loans were originated in those neighborhoods. But let's go into the deeper tab, and I'll show you some statistics there. So you'll see here I have pulled up the subprime home purchase loan amount by ethnicity and by money, juxtaposed against subprime foreclosure rates and all of the data there. And what you'll see is that overwhelmingly subprime loans were made to Black and Hispanic individuals vis-a-vis white and Asian. Remember, relative to their proportion of the population, they're getting a majority of the subprime loans, and then you see the foreclosure rates are radically disproportionate. So if you move on to the next slide, you'll see some of these lawsuits and what we're talking about here. Remember, we did that montage of disparate impact litigation lawsuits and how much everybody has to pay in the millions and billions.
Yep.
Well, as you would predict from the tragedy of all of this is at the end of it, who was hung for all of this with respect to the who was ultimately sued, who had to pay money, and why. It wasn't Fannie and Freddie. It wasn't the racial community groups. None of them went down and none of them were regulated or sued. No, it ends up being the big banks themselves being sued in these racial discrimination lawsuits for reverse redlining. So you'll see there's Wells Fargo had to pay $175 million. Bank of America had to pay $335 million. And not only that, it created a whole new theory of law that continues to this day called reverse redlining. And here's a 2014 article showing 4 new banks being sued for reverse redlining. JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, and Bank of America, because this was something that was leveraged to the hilt by Obama's Eric Holder administration that ended up shaking down all the banks far after 2008 under this new theory, because there's always going to be disparate impact with respect to minority mortgages, which is one of the reasons that the Trump administration's push to end this is so important right now. So I'm going to send you a link now just to show you a little bit of the dynamics on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and people trying to regulate them. Here is some excerpts just from, I think, a 2004 Senate committee hearing when people were starting to smell some blood in the water, but there was still. Sorry, just give me a second while I pull up the link here. But the good times were so good that nobody made too big a stink out of it. Just hold on one second here while I pull this up. I'm going to
it's pretty depressing because it's all scapegoating throughout. It's like people getting forced into a behavior and then they get sued for overdoing it, but it was the law that was forcing them.
Yeah, but remember, this was also, so here you go. I'm going to put this in, here is a video that I just put in the lobby for you if you want to pull it up. But remember, here you had a Republican president that had a minority ownership drive with a Democrat dominance of the legislature. So you'll see how that played out here with people trying to regulate this market, but simply not having the political power to do so. So go ahead. You can play this clip to see some of the best.
It is indeed a very troubling report, but it is a report of extraordinary importance, not only to those who wish to own a home, but as to the taxpayers of this country who would pay the cost of the cleanup of an enterprise failure. The analysis makes clear that more resources must be brought to bear to ensure the highest standards of conduct are not only required, but more importantly, they are actually met.
Through nearly a dozen hearings where, frankly, we were trying to fix something that wasn't broke. Mr. Chairman, we do not have a crisis at Freddie Mac, and in particular at Fannie Mae, under the outstanding leadership of Mr. Frank Raines.
And as well as the fact that I'm just pissed off at Ophelia, because if it wasn't for you, I don't think that we'd be here in the first place. And now the problem that we have and that we're faced with is maybe some individuals who wanted to do away with GSEs in the first place, you've given them an excuse to try to have this forum so that we can talk about it and maybe change the direction and the mission of what the GSEs had, which they've done a tremendous job. There's been nothing that was indicated that's wrong, with Fannie Mae. Freddie Mac has come up on its own, and the question that then presents is the competence that your agency has with reference to the deciding and regulating these GSEs. And so I wish I could sit here and say that I'm not upset with you, but I am very upset because, what you do is you give, maybe giving a reason to, as Mr. Gonzalez said, to give someone a heart surgery when they really don't need it.
In addition to our important oversight role in this committee, I hope that we will move swiftly to create a new regulatory structure for Fannie Mae, for Freddie Mac, and the Federal Home Loan Banks.
This hearing is about the political lynching of Franklin Raines.
There is a very simple solution Congress must create a new regulator with powers at least equal to those of other financial regulators, such as the OCC or the Federal Reserve.
What would make you, why should I have confidence? Why should anyone have confidence in you as a regulator at this point?
I can't believe this. This is what I consider to be the right-wing party, the Republicans asking for regulation and the Democrats complaining against it.
That's right. It's weird, right? It's almost like they don't really care about the principles and they just want the money. That can't be right.
And I can't believe that essentially this is framed as regulations or not regulations, but in the end, from a libertarian perspective, even the non-regulated approach is essentially still a government intervention, as long as these two heads, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, or whatever they're called, as long as they're there and being funded by the government, it's still a form of regulated system.
And remember, they blamed deregulation. They blamed a greedy capitalist and deregulation for the reason this happened.
Wasn't that at all.
It's just a...
Sorry, Congressman. OFAO did not improperly apply accounting rules. Freddie Mac did. OFAO did not try to manage earnings improperly. Freddie Mac did. So this isn't about the agency engaging in improper conduct. It's about Freddie Mac.
And we passed Sarbanes-Oxley, which was a very tough response to that. And then I realized that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac wouldn't even come under it. They weren't under the 34 Act. They weren't under the 33 Act. They play by their own rules. And I'm tempted to ask how many people in this room are in the payroll of Fannie Mae, because what they do is they basically hire every lobbyist they can possibly hire. They hire some people to lobby, and they hire some people not to lobby so that the opposition can't hire them.
But a concern that I have is you're making very specific, what you have correctly acknowledged, broad and categorical judgments about the management of this institution, about the willfulness of practices that may or may not be in controversy. You've imputed various motives to the people running the organization. You went to the board and put a 48-hour ultimatum on them without having any specific regulatory authority to put that kind of ultimatum on them. That sounds like some kind of an invisible line has been crossed.
Fannie Mae has manipulated, in my judgment, OFAO for years. And for OFAO to finally come out with a report as strong as it is tells me that's got to be the minimum, not the maximum.
etc. You seem to be saying, well, these are in areas which could raise safety and soundness problems. I don't see anything in your report that raises safety and soundness problems.
Under the outstanding leadership of Mr. Frank Raines, everything in the 1992 Act has worked just fine. In fact, the GSEs have exceeded their housing goals. What we need to do today is to focus on the regulator, and this must be done in a manner so as not to impede their affordable housing mission, a mission that has seen innovation flourish from desktop underwriting to 100% loans.
I find this to be inconsistent and a rush to judgment. I get the feeling that the markets are not worried about the safety and soundness of Fannie Mae, as OFAO says that it is, but of course the markets are not political.
But I have seen nothing in here that suggests that the safety and soundness are at issue, and I think it serves us badly to raise safety and soundness as a kind of a general shibboleth when it does not seem to me to be an issue.
Mr. Raines, $1.1 million bonus on a $526,000 salary. Jamie Gorelick, $779,000 $100,000 bonus on a salary of $567,000. I mean, this is what you state on page 11 is nothing less than staggering. The 1998 earnings per share number turned out to be $3.23 and 9 mils, a result that Fannie Mae met the EPS maximum payout goal right down to the penny. Fannie Mae understood the rules and simply chose not to follow them. That if Fannie Mae had followed the practices, there wouldn't have been a bonus that year.
And you have about 3% of your portfolio set aside. If a bank gets below 4%, they are in deep trouble. So I just want you to explain to me why I shouldn't be satisfied with 3%.
Because banks don't, there aren't any banks who only have multifamily and single-family loans. These assets are so riskless that their capital for holding them should be under 2%.
Fine.
I think the responsibility that the Democrats have may rest more in resisting any efforts by Republicans in the Congress or by me when I was president to put some standards and tighten up a little on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
All right, so it's a big pile of crap.
Right.
There are some positive things in there. There are some people trying to awaken to irregularities, but it's essentially people fighting for their side, and I'm not sure here, what do the Republicans have to gain in it? Is that just they're carrying from the George Bush era a respect for this system? What's happening with the Republican at that moment?
Yeah, well, with the Republican Party, remember, it's not a monolith. You know, there are varying degrees of how on board you are with the, neocon establishment, primary power structure. And what you saw there was a concern about, just basic budget risk, and the fact that you had an organization that appeared to be this is the oversight committee hearings, which every oversight committee has bipartisan representation of both House Democrats and House Republicans. So what you see is that those on the Oversight Commission as far back as 2004 were clamoring for some sort of top to be put on Fannie Mae for buying these subprime loans and then spreading them like cancer throughout the financial system. And then I don't think it's a surprise that virtually all of the Democrats that you saw in that clip were either Black or Jewish with respect to the, and I say that because of the, not to make any generalization about groups, but because they were the ranking members of the Congressional Black Caucus. You had Maxine Waters, you had Clyburn, you had Barney Frank, and this regulation of Fannie Mae and the need to make sure it remains relatively deregulated is because that money valve had to stay open for diversity industry money to keep flowing from the banks into both the communities and into the kickback system that the regulators themselves profited from. So they needed that valve to stay open, so they shut down any attempt by the Republican Oversight Committee, Republican members of the Oversight Committee, to actually regulate it. So
it's a multi-level bullying. So you bully the bank with CRAs, then you bully Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae through various forms of corruption and pay for play. And then when the lawmakers are trying to control Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, you just oppose to what the lawmakers are trying to do. So they control the chain at 3 levels of government down to their communities.
Exactly. That's the main
This
point.
is so evil, Frame Games. So
Yeah,
evil, it's hard to take.
It's very nasty. So let me just, I think if you refresh the presentation, there's just one or two more slides I want to get through and keep this sort of nice and short. There's a lot of stuff we didn't get into just because I don't want to get too boiled down with the technical stuff. But you should see the fourth slide here should say the racial dynamics. Let me know if that pulls up or if you need to.
Yep, that's
if
here.
you need to refresh the presentation. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. And it should say there should be about 7 images. I think it's the fourth one in the deck. Yep. Okay. So there's one image missing from that that I'll just talk through, which is basically I have it in my version, but it just shows that this is from the CRA compliance manual, and it shows the how to comply with the CRA if you are a big bank. And here's some, just in the top left is just a clip from Bank of America's website, and it talks about how does CRA impact deal making across the country. And that highlighted area shows financial institutions often have specific CRA, Community Reinvestment Act needs in various locations. So the appetite for a given deal in a given area may depend on which financial institution has CRA need in that market. Usually, high-density urban locations coincide with areas of high CRA need across the landscape of financial institutions. Thus, lending, investment, and therefore development are reinforced in those markets. CRA need means a need to achieve the right numbers in order to get regulatory authority, in order to get a satisfactory rating in your CRA compliance report as a bank. Do you understand? The more proportion of minorities, the higher your CRA need.
Mm-hmm.
You understand it's a credit system.
Yeah.
So I just want to walk you through how this works in a little bit more detail. So you'll see there in the thing underneath it, the determination for CRA need is not just low income. It is based on the racial population in that area using census data. So for example, there's something called the majority minority tract, which is that in areas you have a higher CRA need in places where the last census data showed a higher proportion of racial minorities. And this is something we went over in at the tail end of the Starbucks report, but I think it bears repeating here. Just so people really understand what banks are under, for CRA compliance. First of all, you need a separate division in your bank that's dedicated full-time to CRA compliance. Okay, it is hundreds of hours of preparation for each CRA report. Best practices include rolling out the red carpet for the regulator to make sure that the entire experience of them coming into your bank and leaving it is filled with all sorts of fluffy, fluffy presentations, and make sure they're well treated. Have your best presenter, well rehearsed in all of the major talking points. Have all of the racial brochures, on hand about all of your accomplishments for how you've helped and assisted, racial minorities over the course of that year. And then, something that we've covered before, but in case folks didn't see our Starbucks, part 3 of the Starbucks series, you'll see some examples here. How it works is if you're a bank, all of this is from, the bottom 2 images show these different assessment areas. And what it shows, to make sure that you cannot redline an area, if you're trying to comply with the CRA, in your CRA report, you have to show all of the loans that you have made in an area and plot them on a map. And then you need to estimate for the regulators all the different areas that you believe should be under CRA assessment, meaning for determination for how many minorities you've made loans to. First, you make a subjective assessment, and then the regulator comes in and determines, based on the latest racial census tract, whether or not you've unfairly excluded them. And the thing is, how extensive it is absolutely ridiculous. So you'll see that in the first example, And remember, this is a guide for bankers here. In the first example, they show lots of dots. The green area shows the self-proposed CRA assessment data from the bank, showing that in counties A, G, E, and F is where they believe they need to hit their racial scorecard thresholds, right? And they're saying that's the area in which we should be assessed for how many racial minorities we've made loans to, because that's where the wide majority of our loans are from. But then you'll see the real assessment area, the one that they're actually legally liable for, as would be determined by a regulator, is not just A, E, F, and G, but it's also in H, because they've made a significant number of loans in County H. And according to the yellow highlighted area, the latest census tract shows that there is majority minority neighborhoods in those areas that are not being served by the bank. So accordingly, in order to have a satisfactory rating in the CRA, that bank now needs to do exactly what it did in these other counties all over County H and make sure it gets its racial numbers right in County H. And remember from part one,
it's impossible to respect these rules
unless you are willing to take a hit in profit. Because the policy of race supersedes the policy of free businesses having authority to do business as they please. It overrides the colorblind principle of judging people by the content of their character and their credit score. And all of this is done as a ongoing race tax that every big bank in the country still to this day has to abide by. And it acts as a giant one more racial welfare program and one more racial discrimination program. And you'll see how pervasive this is. And again, like in the next summary here, they thought in example 4, the CRA assessment area, a bank might think that its only assessment area is County A because that's where it has the overwhelming majority of its loans. But because it does some loans in County B, and there are some majority minority census tracts in counties B as well as D. Now, all 3 of those assessment areas fall under the CRA. So that means that a bank is now liable. They need to suddenly open up shop. And remember, it's not just marketing. They have to hit the numbers. They have CRA needs in those areas. So now they need to open up branches in places that they have absolutely no intention of doing business just because there happens to be Black and Hispanic people there. And if you remember from part 1 how pervasive that is, that's everything from making sure that those branches are operated by Black and Hispanic majority employees, from reducing your credit standards there, from subsidizing, from having lower FICO scores required for. Remember that whole 30-minute list we went through? All of that applies to this. Remember that exhaustive list of, oh my God, I can't believe it. That all kicks in the moment that it's determined that you're in that CRA area. So that's how extensive it is.
This is severe. It becomes a form of affirmative action and a form of racism against white people, because at some point some banks might be tempted to give some loans in County D, but if they see, oh no, I don't want County B to be included in my CRA, they're just going to drop business here and they're going to super concentrate, and you end up having very deserving white people in County D. Just because they are split by a community of Black people, they will never get loans by this bank, not because they can't afford it, but because the bank cannot afford including that region in its CRA calculation.
Exactly. And not just deserving white applicants, deserving middle-class Black applicants.
Yeah.
If you are a creditworthy Black applicant in Community D there, now this is an example of how it dicks over the Black middle class because of this coalition between the low and loud and the high and rich. So, I mean, it ends up squeezing out the deserving Black middle class there as well. So this is something that we still to this day live with. And now it remains to be seen how in 2018 and 2019 the Ben Carson chaired HUD and the Trump Trump leadership and the new sort of MAGA coalition that does not play ball with the neocon shit, how well they are going to act in terms of, and how much leverage they have to take down these racially discriminatory laws, and how well that will be enforced in a legal court system that not only has the benefit, fortunately, of a conservative majority in the Supreme Court, but Trump has also done a stellar job of appointing conservative federal justices all throughout the appellate system, which means that these lawsuits, when challenged, may suddenly have a favorable climate to them, which is one more reason why it's so important that Democrats are trying to impeach Trump so that this money system stays alive, because a lot of that funds the soft dollar political machine of the DNC itself.
What do we know about Trump's intention? Did he indicate that it was his intention to end that?
Yes, although the amount of it, he's basically announced an initiative to repeal large portions of the Community Reinvestment Act to bring it in line with a modern bank modernization reform. But I don't believe that there is much detail on that yet. I think he's going to unroll it beginning in 2019. So I will be covering it. To the extent it makes a good episode, we'll be keeping everyone in the loop on how that is. But it's a major white pill that finally people are doing something about this.
Wonderful. This might be a big theme of the next electoral campaign.
We'll see. I mean, it's certainly, especially the more people know, the more likely it becomes a town hall question, and then the more likely it is to see the light of day. So tell everyone you know about this. Tell your friends. Tell your kids. Hide your wife. Tell everybody you know about this, so that this becomes something that, even if the mainstream media doesn't want to report on it, they might have no choice but to have to.
Well, this was absolutely incredible, and in fact, DP sends a super chat and he says, "Stunning depth, incredible." It was absolutely incredible to learn that this has been going on. I recognize stuff that I've seen when I was young. These debates about Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, I've heard about them, but I didn't know what was hidden behind them. It's absolutely disgusting. There is a takeover of the law processes to impose diversity, and this is then having huge consequences on individual lives, on businesses not being able to do businesses the way they want and the way it's better for them. It is absolutely worrying, such a big system that we can only be, I personally at least feel desperate in front of such corruption.
Right. But change can start beginning at any level. The president, the legislature, the community groups themselves, the community organizing requires a level of consciousness first, and that's one of the things that hopefully our media work is helping to foster and provide support for.
Wonderful. Was there anything to add?
I think that's all for now. Keep you guys updated on how this side of the law develops, and thanks again for hosting a wonderful show and for the chat for tuning in.
Thank you. Bye-bye.